right, sounds good. Thanks. Hello everyone. This is Corey with Camera Coach, and you are listening to Full Frame with Corey. Welcome to episode 5. Episode 5 is going to be talking about full frame cameras. Are they worth it? Do you need one? What's the difference between that and a crop sensor? All the above. So we're just going to talk through a little bit about that. Before we get into the topic though, I do want to just throw out a couple of things. My website plug first. So if you have not visited my website, which is photocameracoach.com, then please take a look, and you can find sample images. You can find my gear guide, which is links to recommended equipment. I've got videos. There's a blog that we're starting up, and you can subscribe to our newsletter if you're not really the social media type. A new addition actually is going to be a link to our Flickr page. That's where we're going to keep most of our portfolio. So you'll see a few sample images on the website, but the most up-to-date work is going to be on the Flickr page. So, and the Flickr account is at Photo Camera Coach. All right, so let's move into a couple of shout-outs. I just want to make sure that I always recognize those who are helping to make this podcast possible. And for starters, Rogue Media. I just love the studio that they've got set up here, and access to it is amazing. So can't really do something like this. Again, I say it all the time. I can't do it at home. I have 3 little kids at home, so someone's bound to walk in the room or something like that, and just kind of throw things off. Let's see, another shout out is going to be Triple Win. It's official. I will be teaching photography classes with Triple Win in the fall, which is part of Rappaport Academy in Waco, Texas. So excited about that. Doing some more after school type classes instead of just in the full classroom kind of deal. So stepping away from that for a little bit to build up what we're doing here at Camera Coach. And another shout out to my Patreon supporters, Mandy, Kenan, and Corey. Those are my level 2 supporters, just helping to make this stuff possible because you don't really get paid for podcasts and everything. At least I don't. So there we go. So shout outs, website, all that sort of stuff. Now we're going to jump into the topic of full frame cameras. Okay, so full frame. For starters, what is a full frame camera? When we're talking about a full frame camera, we're basically talking about right now it's digital. Everything's digital for the most part. A digital camera that has a sensor that's the same size as 35 millimeter film. So 35 millimeter obviously was before digital, which not very many students are aware of what was before what they have now. But that was, the old stuff was a film. But now with the digital stuff, a full frame camera is going to have a sensor that's the same size as that film. So if you hear someone say full frame or crop sensor, that means that the crop sensor is basically a smaller sensor that fits in the camera. And since it's going to have a smaller sensor, it's going to affect the images. And we'll get into the differences and how that works in just a minute. Okay, so again, full frame kind of correlates to full frame to 35 millimeter film. So the sensor is the size of 35 millimeter film. And if you're not familiar with what a sensor is, well, let's kind of back up there too. So a sensor is the part of the camera that absorbs the light and is translated into the image. Okay, and so without a sensor, you can't really take a picture. And so it's a very important piece of the camera. And so if you don't know your camera parts, there you go. That's class right there. Anyways, moving right along. So what's the difference, right? So I mentioned the size of the sensor, but what does that do to the camera? So the larger the sensor, should make sense actually. That means the more light it can take in, even if it's a low light situation. So one of the better or the bigger advantages to having a full frame camera is going to be low light performance will be better than a crop sensor. So I would think that makes sense. You have a larger sensor, it's going to take in more light, right? So also because of that larger sensor, it's going to have a better color depth. And that's really technical. I'm not going to go into what color depth is and why it's important, because for a lot of people it's not really that important, because once you have so many colors, it really doesn't register for most people, right? So it's kind of like overkill with the whole megapixel thing as well, which that's cameras with 46 megapixels it's just after a certain point, to most people, they're not going to be able to tell the difference. So now for the technical people, the ones that are really printing a lot and that sort of stuff, color depth is important. So a full frame camera is definitely going to be something to look at if you're really kind of into the technical things. Okay, another thing is a full frame is going to give you the same focal length as a 35 millimeter camera, and so the difference between that, you really would have to have a full frame and a crop sensor kind of next to each other and look through the viewfinder to really see the difference. But a crop sensor is actually called a crop sensor because it's cropped in. It looks closer, even if it says it's 50 millimeters. It's not really 50 millimeters in the standard of the 35 millimeter. And so that means that most crop sensors are 1.5 times or somewhere around that as far as the size or the focal length for a full frame, right? So I'm using the 50 millimeter example just because 50 is a nice, easy number to do the math with. If it's 1.5 crop sensor, then that means it's really not a 50 millimeter lens. It's the equivalent of 75 millimeters. And so if I had a full frame camera and a crop sensor next to each other, the only way to get the same focal length, the same kind of tightness on the shot is going to be to do that math and know, okay, for my full frame, I'm going to need a 75 millimeter focal length, and that's going to be the same as my 50. And so that's just kind of one of those things. If you do a lot of sports and things where you're trying to really zoom in and get as close as possible to your subject, well, then you probably don't want something that's making things seem farther away, right? So you don't want a full frame because then you're just going to need a bigger lens to get a tight shot. And so I'm kind of leading into the disadvantages, I guess, if you will. The whole space thing, scooting back for space or scooting forward, could be a positive or negative. It really depends on what type of photography you're into. And so that's just kind of the question right there. So a lot of questions that we tackle are very subjective. They're very much case by case, right? And so it really depends. If you're a sports photographer, the full frame, you could use a full frame and then crop in, just because they usually have large megapixel photos, and you're usually not going to lose much resolution out of the photo. But that just seems like a lot of work to me, when really if you just have the crop sensor and you shoot and it's already cropped, then there you go. So the quality really, it's not going to be something that you're going to notice a lot, unless you get into low light situations. So low light's kind of that asterisk. It's one of those situations where if you're shooting a lot of football games or whatever and it's nighttime, then yeah, maybe you might need to look into a full frame. Or if you're doing weddings, you're doing other things that kind of have the variance of light where you might get some daytime, you might get some low light, that sort of thing. The full frame will perform better in low light. Okay, and so that is just one of those where maybe you have to shoot like that and then you crop in. It just really depends on what you're doing. So some of the advantages I mentioned were color depth and light performance, low light performance. And I kind of say that for certain fields of photography, the full frame lends itself to those better. So things like real estate or portraits. If you're in a studio and you don't have a ton of space, then you may not really want a crop sensor. You may not want something that's going to make the photo look so tight that you don't really feel like you have space, right? And so architecture, real estate, you're trying to show like maybe the full building or something, like you need the space. You need that to be kind of zoomed out, if you will, right? You don't want it cropped. And so that whole focal length thing can be a plus or a minus depending on what you're doing. I'm going to go ahead and jump into, I'll say, disadvantages here. One of the major things that you'll notice if you're kind of shopping for a full frame camera is the price. The price is going to be more expensive because the quality of the images is going to be technically better. Okay, and so you do get what you pay for in a lot of senses when it comes to photography, and so you're going to pay more for a full frame camera. So that's really, I think, one of those where you have to know your budget, you have to know your needs, and then you make the best decision based off of that. Maybe you start off with a crop sensor, and then you evolve into maybe you're doing more portraits in a studio, or maybe you're doing more architecture or more real estate or something like that. And then you just would evolve into like, hey, okay, now I really need a full frame because I need that extra focal length. I need that extra space back. And so it's never really just a one-time answer. I shoot mostly with crop sensors right now. So I have a Nikon D7500. That's my main go-to. And I do have a mirrorless, just the Nikon Z50. And all of those are crop sensors. I do a lot of sports. I do portraits. Most of them are not really in studio right now, but I'm really about to start going heavily into studio work for headshots and senior portraits and things like that, even product photography. And so I'm going to need that space back. I'm going to need to really look at a full frame option. And so luckily I have a full frame option, even though I shoot Nikon a lot. I do have a Canon 5D Mark III, so I know that one's full frame, and that's what stays in the studio that we're putting together right now. So yeah, just kind of that knowledge really helps you make the choices that you need to know, that you need to make, not know. And so the other disadvantage, I only had two here for disadvantages, would be you need a larger lens to get tight shots. And so lenses are not cheap. I think that's one of the biggest revelations when you're first starting off with photography is you go and you buy yourself a set of like a camera with two lenses or whatever in a bag, and then you think you're set and you're like going. It's like, oh well, why are there so many lenses out there? For just this camera, there's 10, 15 different lenses, because there's so many different things that those lenses can do, and with one obviously being zooming, right? So if you have a telephoto lens, something that can reach out there and get closer to those things that are farther away, you're kind of working against yourself if you do a lot of long shots and you have a full frame. Just because we talked about this earlier, you're kind of counteracting what you're trying to do, unless you just want to do a lot of editing and cropping on the back end. So if that's your cup of tea, then hey, it's good. You can do that. If there's nothing wrong with it, it's just kind of a preference thing, right? And so price and then just the lenses, just kind of how the lenses affect your shots are the two disadvantages I have. I did mention useful applications for full frame cameras, right? Portraits in a studio. Most studios don't have a ton of space, and so you need that space. Real estate, because again you're getting in small spaces, a lot of rooms are smaller, and use the fisheye or just something like kind of with the wide focal length, and you've got to get a small space into your frame. And then landscape. Landscape's not really just about small space. Maybe you're trying to get as much as possible into the frame, right? And so that's going to lend itself to a full frame camera as well. Bottom line, really, when it comes to full frame cameras, is they're good. They're really good cameras. Technically, you're getting a better piece of equipment if you're buying a full frame as opposed to a crop sensor. But sometimes the advantages become disadvantages, and so it's really kind of a fluid thing. It's just kind of where you're at. And I know I've said that a couple times already. If you're new to photography, well then, you're probably better off with an entry-level or a mid-level DSLR that's got a crop sensor. Get you some quality lenses, learn about the cameras, learn about the lenses, and then go into, well, do I need a full frame, right? And so this is really, really similar to kind of the conversation about mirrorless cameras, right? Because they're kind of the new hot thing, and everybody's kind of pushing their mirrorless cameras, and they're good. They're good. The quality's good. They cost, I'll say, an arm and a leg. If you look at the prices of the good quality ones, not the entry level, but you go advanced or the pro mirrorless, just like the advanced or the pro full frame, you're talking thousands of dollars. Okay, minimum probably $1,500, and so I would really, really caution anybody from jumping into a financial commitment like that, and you really haven't done your homework. You really don't know much about the camera, much about lenses, how the camera works. Get all that stuff out of the way with a cheaper lens, a cheaper camera, right? And then when you're really ready to use a camera to its fullest extent, then you can go and get something that costs more. It's kind of like getting your kid, a Camaro. Well, let's not say Camaro. We'll say getting your kid kind of like a Porsche, for their first car, and they've never really driven. They haven't been through a lot of experiences and the ins and outs of driving. Some people do it, and that's just because they can and they want to, right? And so if you're in that situation, nice, good for you. Not everybody is really in that situation, and so if you're in the situation where you really need to be smart about your choices, because they can, if you make a bad choice, it can set you back. Then yeah, you probably need to take your time. And photography is not something that you'll learn, in just a couple of weeks, a couple of months. I've been at this 13 years, and I'm still learning. The technology is still changing just constantly, and so it's just always changing, and you're always learning. So just don't really go into it with the mindset of you get everything you need once, and that kind of thing. It's just not really the reality. So there you go. Full frame cameras. I am a fan, especially for the studio that we're setting up. I'm really going to be using a full frame camera a lot, and so I'll be kind of going back and forth between the two, depending on the actual job I'll be doing. Because I know that the advantages and disadvantages there. So, all right, that's pretty much going to wrap up the conversation here. I do want to kind of put a few things at the tail end here. If you have any questions about photography or specific cameras even that you'd like to have answered either on my podcast or my live stream, then you can text me at area code 254-307-7469 and just say, hey, I had a question I'd like you to answer on the podcast or something of that nature. Or you could also join the weekly live streams. I will usually put something out ahead of time to let people know when it's going to be scheduled. So that way you can, if you want to just kind of jump into the live stream and then float your question that way. Either way, I definitely want to be able to engage and help tackle questions. So there you go. That's it for questions. Let's see. Oh, okay. So I really appreciate you guys just kind of tuning in. This was episode 5. So we're kind of getting into a rhythm here, and just want to make sure that I go back through and highlight a few ways that you can support what's going on here with Camera Coach. Number one, you can just keep track of what's going on. Check out the website periodically. There'll be workshops. There's a blog that I mentioned is kind of get back rolling. Subscribe to the newsletter, those sort of things. Just engage. That's one way. Another way you can engage is through our Facebook page, which is @PhotoCameraCoach. And so there's a link. Obviously, if you go to the website, then you can get to Facebook from there. There are a few others. So if you are someone who's in the market for a camera or a lens or a bag, etc., then check out the equipment recommendations on the website. It's going to be the gear guide, and that is something that I kind of curate that. There are a few pages there just with different categories, and they're all Amazon links. I'm an Amazon affiliate, so if you don't know what that means, I make a commission off of that, the recommendations if people make a purchase. And I would say 98% of the things on those pages I personally have used. If it's not one that I've personally used, it's one that I've actually had some experience with, just I don't own it. And so not really trying to just throw stuff out there, just try to make sales or whatever. It's really equipment that I've actually had firsthand knowledge of. And so another way you can support is our Patreon page. I did give a shout out to our supporters earlier, and Patreon is just a platform where an artist or someone basically can get support, financial support. These people will just kind of subscribe, say $5 a month or $10 a month, whatever. And there are different things that go along with those levels of subscription, but ultimately it's a way to support kind of the thing that's going on. And so for me, with the podcast, the live streams, those are things that I don't get paid for, and I love doing, but I need something to kind of help in that respect, So the other thing that's not quite ready yet, right now it's August 2nd, and so by the end of August, I will be offering online classes for youth ages 10 to 18. So the online classes will be through a platform called OutSchool, and you can find more information about that on the website. So if you didn't quite catch the thread here, the website is the best place to go. All right, and so that's it. I'm done kind of throwing all my support, stuff at you and all that. But hopefully this was beneficial for you. You understand a little bit more about full frame cameras or the difference between them and crop sensor cameras, and you can make better decisions on your next camera purchase. Thanks again for joining. I hope you have a great day. This is Corey signing off. What's up? Good. Yeah. Okay. Man, I kind of stumbled through some of that.